Welcome to everyone who came into the room after we started just having our informal discussions. I should say, so my name's Brett Bly. I'm going to be chairing this seminar, and I'll start out by pointing out that this seminar is being live streamed. So postgraduate students, staff, and other interested people who are interested come to these seminars. You can ask questions at the end of the presentation. There'll be a slot for that, or you can ask questions throughout using the chat box. The session's going to be recorded, and those recordings are made available on the Department of Educational Research's YouTube channel sometime shortly afterwards. We tend to ask attendees to switch off their camera and mute their microphone during the presentation, and keep your microphone muted if you are not directly intending to speak. I'll introduce the speaker. So Joanne Hardman is an associate professor in the School of Education at UCT, which is the University of Cape Town. Joanne is a psychologist by training, and her research focuses on child development and teaching and learning with technology. Joanne holds the Distinguished Teachers Award from UCT and is an NRF rated scientist. It's worth pointing out before we get started that this seminar is going to finish a bit earlier than was advertised. We expect about 1:40. The reason being, you might have gathered from some of the discussion beforehand that a student protest movement has erupted on Joanne's university campus this morning, and the campus looks like it's going to have to close. And it's worth knowing that Joanne is giving this seminar in the midst of quite a lot of disruption. So if there are technical issues, we'll know what has happened. That being said, Joanne, we're very eager to hear what you have to say and looking forward to your presentation.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Brett. Gosh, that sounds wonderful, and let's see what she's got to say. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is the implications of COVID on pedagogical practices. Specifically, I'm referring to South Africa, where we have something called fee and no fee schools. A fee school is where you would pay school fees, and a no fee school is protected by the government, and the government pays subsidies for those schools, so that they are the very poorest of the poor schools, with lagging infrastructure, etc. So this, I just wanted to show you a picture. South Africa has the highest Gini coefficient, I think, in the world. I think we surpassed Brazil a little while ago. As you can see, there's one road here, if you look at this picture, that separates an affluent area with tennis courts, swimming pools, from what is a poorer area where there are dwellings that are not brick and mortar, made of tin, iron, and wood. So we would have a school that is a no-feeing school, would be dealing with the poorest of the poor students who can't afford to go to school. And it's quite remarkable because we have some schools in this country that charge upwards of 300,000 Rand a year, which is 100,000 pounds, 150,000 pounds a year for school. And then we have schools that charge absolutely nothing. So I want to talk a bit about what happened in COVID, because the assumption would be in COVID, where we moved straight on to online teaching, that the no fee paying schools would really fall off the bandwagon altogether, because they don't have, or the hypothesis was, the thinking was, they didn't have access to novel technologies or novel pedagogies, not necessarily technology, novel pedagogies in which to deal with the fact that schools were locked down. Okay, so we had this lockdown, and I remember when it came, I was at university, and it was 2 hours before I was set to give a lecture to 220 students, and the university was closed down. I had to go home, and I'd never heard of Zoom. I had to go home and try and Zoom my lecture to these students. And this is me, a university professor, quite affluent, having to struggle my way through it. So the question that we were wondering about is, when this happens, when there's this lockdown and there's a forced change in the way you teach, what actually happens? Do you use novel technology to teach in a different way? If so, how? And when I refer to technology, I'm not just solely referring to online technology. Technology such as radio and television is something that you probably in the more developed world probably don't use radio as much as we do, for example, but we have radio programs that started broadcasting stuff for students to work through. And we have television programs, Sesame Street. Well, we've got Takalani Sesame, which started to broadcast programs to students. So the question we asked is, what are teachers' perceptions of how novel technological tools altered their pedagogy during the pandemic? Okay, so the novel pedagogical tools we had in mind to begin with were computers, laptops, iPads, Chromebooks, these kinds of things. Only through the research did we begin to start thinking, okay, maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's also the TV, maybe it's also the I nearly said wireless, which is very old-fashioned, the radio. Okay, so the theory that I work in is called cultural historical theory, and it comes basically from the work of a Soviet psychologist called Lev Vygotsky. Now, the fascinating thing about Lev Vygotsky is he situates cognition, the development of human cognition, in the sociocultural context in which it unfolds. So the context in which you find yourself, the time, the place, the social environment, the culture, all impact on how you develop, okay? And those of you who are familiar with Marx will hear the resonance with Marx, where Marx said quite explicitly, it's not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. It's a very important point, this. It's a mind-blowing point for someone who was trained as a psychologist in the Western way. I was trained to think that pathology lay with an individual. In fact, pathology doesn't lie with an individual. Pathology lies within the culture and the social context in which that happens. So, for example, you'll find in France, very few students are diagnosed with attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and that's because it's not something that's really recognized in France. Whereas in America, you'll find 5% of the population is identified with ADHD. In my own country, you'll find people diagnosed with ADHD, young children diagnosed with ADHD who live in traumatic circumstances where there are gang warfare, where they see people getting shot. And if you know much about psychology, you know that the same symptoms that someone with ADHD would manifest are the symptoms that you manifest if you have been subjected to trauma, lack of ability to focus, hyperactivity. So the culture, the context where you grow up really does form you psychologically. This is a theory that I take. I'm not saying that it's the one you should take, but for me, it's the one that works. And what I say to my students, if something works for you, you wear that coat. If it doesn't work for you, move along. So what do I take from cultural historical theory? Well, there are a number of issues that I take from it. The first is that one way of seeing cultural historical theory is through what Irigo Engstrom, as you see these triangles here, he refers to cultural historical activity theory. Now, cultural historical activity theory builds on the work of Vygotsky. It's what I suppose we call neo-Vygotskian, in that it separates, it illuminates the context you find yourself in. And this is the work of Engstrom. And basically he says psychological processes emerge through culturally mediated, historically developing practical activity. So who we are, the identity we take on, is mediated by the culture that we find ourselves in. My daughter will be 13 next month. She has never known a constant supply of electricity in her whole life. She does not understand the concept of having electricity all the time within a day. So she asks in the morning, for example, when is load shedding? Whereas I have a cousin in the UK whose daughter does this apparently, and the light turns on and off. Okay, we don't have that. So this is cultural historical theory according to Engstrom. Now, what I like about this triangle, it is contested by some people, but what I like about it is how it can be used as an analytical framework. So if you look at it, you have the subject that you're studying. Okay, in this case, we're studying teachers, who uses mediating artifacts. So mediating artifacts are the tools that they use. So for example, iPads, computers, laptops, radios, TVs, to act on the object. Now, the object is very slippery in chat, in this theory. It's not very well articulated in some writings, but basically what it is it's the thing that motivates you to act. And the motivation is for students to understand and to cover the content in school. So schools have closed down because of COVID. The teacher, who's the subject here, uses the tools available to him or her to work on covering the content. And the outcome would be a child who has acquired the content or concepts. Now, we all act within rules, a community and division of labor. Okay, so these things mediate us as well. So for example, there's a mediating rule between myself and the community if I'm a teacher. Certain things I can't do if I'm a teacher. I can't go to your house and sit down and teach your child there. These are not things that are necessarily accepted. Division of labor refers to who does what role is enacted in a particular activity. So the activity system, so it's an entire system. This triangle is a system. When you are seeking to analyze someone like a teacher, which is what we were doing, you can't look simply at the teacher, the subject. You have to look at the entire system. This is what cultural historical activity theory gives us. So activity systems are object-orientated, artifact-mediated collective activity is the system. That's a unit of analysis. So that triangle is the unit of analysis that we've looked at, bridging the gulf between the individual subject and the societal structure. That's a hell of a, I mean, Harry Daniels wrote that description of it. It's very wordy, but in a nutshell, it's the triangle that we use as the basic unit of our analytical system. So in that triangle, you have the subject, teacher, the object, which is the motivation that you work on, instruments, mediating artifacts, community, and division of labor. Right. The basic principles of chat are that human activity is collective and human behavior originates within the social realm. This is something sometimes my students grapple with. How can you say that my identity, who I am, it comes from where I'm from? And so I do a lot of thought experiments with them. You know, if I ask you to think of a flower, what flower comes into your head? They each have different flowers. Now, why is that? If everyone was, if your social realm had no impact on you, why does the idiosyncratic meaning you attach to a flower, whatever the flower is in your head, is it different for other people? So I take it quite, yeah, I'd have to be shown that the social doesn't play a huge role on development, especially in my context. Activity theory studies development and change. Activity systems are constantly subject to change, okay? This is an interesting thing because Engstrom talks about contradictions, so does Marx, and so does Hegel. Contradictions are sort of double binds that exist in an activity system. So COVID comes in, if you can think about this, COVID comes in and locks us down. There's a huge contradiction that now emerges. We can't face the children, but we have to cover this content, this big book of content here, plus we have to develop their understanding. There's a contradiction between deep learning and surface cover of the content. Where will the teacher go? A mind is social and it grows out of joint activity. Tools mediate our psychology. We never come at the world blank. We always look at the world with some mediating lens. Activity theory assumes that people are active cognizing agents, but that they act in sites that are not necessarily of their choosing. So I I said to Brett and Dee, I would probably have to leave earlier today because we have problems with electricity and there are disruptions on campus. Now, that's part of my activity system. I'm a lecturer at the University of Cape Town, but my ability to lecture tonight downstairs is constrained by other things that are happening. And finally, we use a contextualist methodology. So what did we do? We did a survey, open questions, closed questions, and the paper reports on this, okay? We used for the qualitative questions, I was looking for how to explain different pedagogical types that arose in the data. And when I talk about types, I'm talking about ideal types. I'm not talking about something that is inhabited by one teacher at all times. I guess it's like a jersey, you put on and off as your context changes. So this was these are the questions I asked myself as I was going through the analysis. This is a loose analytical framework, you know, what is produced, what tools are used, what are the rules in the classroom, what motivates the activity, who shares the object, and who does what, who determines the power, who determines what is meaningful. Very often, in fact, most often in traditional classes, it's the teacher who determines what is meaningful and what is correct. And this is to be expected. Certain concepts do have epistemic weight that can't be shifted, but in a cultural historical framework, I would also encourage my students to bring their activities, their meaning, their idiosyncratic meanings to bear on things in order to make meaning of what we're doing in a class. So what did we find? Okay, so we did fee and non-fee paying schools. So the fee paying schools charge fees, and the non-fee paying schools charge absolutely nothing for the very poor, the very impoverished people. So larger percentages of teachers in no-fee schools reported having lower level of computer literacy. Obviously, okay, this is not a huge surprise. If you are in a no-fee paying school, the likelihood of having a computer lab, never mind a computer, is not strong, okay? Even though the government has rolled out computers into schools, you must bear in mind that they did this and left the schools to pay for the data and for connectivity. Now, the schools can't pay that. They can't, you know, they cannot even feed the children who are there at the school. So they certainly can't pay for data, and neither can parents, okay? So we would expect that the teachers in the no-fee paying schools are less comfortable with using computers. Did they use new pedagogy? So the next question we asked. So 25% of teachers in no-fee schools used new pedagogy that was linked to ICTs. Now, I mean, that sounds little, but wow, 25% of teachers in schools where they have severe restrictions on using ICTs developed new mechanisms, new pedagogical mechanisms, new pedagogical praxis, let me say that, compared to 47% of fee-paying schools. Yes, obviously in the fee-paying schools, we see that 47% of them use the ICT to develop new technology. It's substantially more than 25%, but the fact that even 25% of the no-fee paying schools were using novel technology to develop new ways of teaching the children is quite remarkable. When they used the novel technology, did it change how they teach? Now, something that interests me. Pedagogy interests me a lot because I think teachers are hell of an important. I think teachers are probably the most important people we ever encounter in our lives, because they are the ones who mediate our cognitive development for, 10, 12 years of our life. In fact, if you go to creche at the age of 2, I mean, they're there mediating synaptogenesis when it's actually happening. So teachers are incredibly important. So what did we find? We found across the fee and non-fee paying schools. So we didn't just find in the fee paying schools that pedagogy had changed. In the non-fee paying schools, we find that IT altered their technology. And there were two broad types of pedagogical practices we could identify in the qualitative data. The one we call collaborative pedagogy and the other we call reinforcement pedagogy. So let's have a look at this. I don't know if you can see this. Let me just move this up here. So as I say, again, a pedagogical type is sort of ideal type, okay? It's not, it doesn't adhere in any single teacher. So if we have a look here, the collaborative pedagogy, what is the teacher doing? Well, first of all, the teacher has a belief, an attitude that the students can learn actively. Many teachers will tell you that they believe students learn actively, and you will see them giving a passive didactic lesson where they are transmitting knowledge to students. But what we saw in the data is that teachers not only say that they think the children are active cognizing agents, but they use the various different kinds of technology. So laptops, cell phones were used a lot. Now, this is something I hadn't even thought about prior to COVID. Almost everyone in South Africa has a cell phone. And that's a smartphone, almost everyone. One of my students during COVID was in a rural village in the Eastern Cape, with living in a homestead, in a one-room homestead with 9 other people, and he handed in a 4,500-word essay on WhatsApp. I don't know how you can do that, with what patience you must have to do that, but it's remarkable what these young people will do. So what we had is teachers using YouTube, Facebook, Class Dojo, tablets, and what the teachers are saying in their qualitative data is that the use of the technology is actually allowing more interaction between the students, because previously some of the students had no voice. They had no way to engage in the class. When you're in a class of 45 children or 90 children, as the instance is sometimes, I have been in a class with 90 children, it's very difficult to make your voice heard. In fact, it's difficult for the teacher to make their voice heard. So when the technology was used, it opened up a new vista for children to engage, children who were from severely deprived backgrounds to engage. Of course, the caveat is the children, these are primary school children, the very junior primary, the foundation phase, 1 to 3. These children didn't have cell phones, their parents had cell phones, and the parents couldn't afford to buy data. So that we have to bear in mind that is a constraining factor to people using cell phones. What we find also in this collaborative type pedagogy is that the teachers are developing conceptual understanding, not just covering the content, but what they are working on is developing the child's understanding of what that concept is. And the division of labor is less asymmetrical than you would find in a traditional classroom. It's certainly in cultures like the Tsivenda in northern South Africa. If you're a student, you can't look the teacher in the eye ever. You don't look at the teacher. That's very rude, and it's taboo. So they're very asymmetrical roles in some of our schools. And what we found is that the use of technology allowed these roles to be less asymmetrical because the children didn't have to look at the teacher. They just wrote WhatsApps or engaged in a Google Classroom activity. And the rules were quite interesting. The social rules were respect, sharing knowledge, collaboration, responding to questions, slower pace. All of the teachers said they slowed their pace down because of COVID. Now, for those of us, not me, for those who want to cover the curriculum and test children, that's not a good thing. You don't want to slow pace because you want them to cover the content regardless of whether they understand or not. for me, slowing the pace is magical, because it enables children to learn who may not be on the same page at the same pace as other children in the class. So reinforcement pedagogy was the other pedagogy we noticed. And reinforcement pedagogy is, as it says, the object of this, what the teachers were working on is, they said that children were active, and they said that children, actively learned, and, they used workbooks, textbooks, worksheets, print media. They didn't use, for reinforcement pedagogy, we didn't have use of technology. So this was in the schools where there was no technology used. And what they were working on is reinforcing the knowledge that the children have and covering the curriculum. And of course, here we see there's a contradiction. I mentioned contradictions earlier, and it's a contradiction between reinforcing the content versus developing concepts. Reinforcing concepts such as drill and practice is a wonderful thing to do. You have to reinforce, you have to practice in order to lay down memory tracts, okay? The problem becomes if you're just reinforcing, you're just teaching what they already know. What about the new knowledge? What about developing concepts? And that's what we found. So there was a contradiction also in the outcome, because the contradiction was between covering the curriculum versus deeper understanding of the curriculum. Contradictions also in parental involvement versus lack of devices. So this is in the community. The parents wanted to be involved, but didn't have devices or data in order to be involved in helping their children. It's a sort of real middle class luxury that COVID enabled some people to be able to help their children, and those were not the working class people, because when COVID hit, they lost their jobs. So what did we find? Pedagogy shifted in some instances under COVID conditions, and two ideal pedagogical types identified in the data. And the one is collaborative pedagogy, which is focused on the acquisition of concepts, and the other is reinforcement pedagogy, which is focused on the reinforcement of concepts in order to cover the curriculums. Both types of pedagogy found in fee and non-fee schools. Collaborative pedagogy only found with the use of ICTs. Very interesting. That was quite an interesting finding. And that is question time. Let me just exit here. I hope I didn't go too fast. I'm looking for the chats.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation, Joanne. So now it's time for questions. If you have a question, then please raise your hand, or you can type it into the chat if you'd prefer, and I can ask the question on your behalf. So would anyone like to pose a question to Joanne? While everyone else is thinking, I'm happy to ask a question. So thanks, Joanne. It was really interesting. I've also done a bit of work using activity theory for things during the COVID pandemic. And I also found this notion of that the object changed and there was a tension around whether this was about content or not. In the case that I examined, which was at a branch, so it's a higher education setting in China, the issue was actually that we wanted to really focus on content because we don't want this to be a purely technological solution. So we want to keep the kind of content as a way of defying technological decision making. But this only survived for a while. It was viewed eventually to be a kind of inadequate object of activity. It's interesting to me, though, that when you think about it, so I don't know if you mentioned it early in your presentation, but the object of activity is a kind of complicated thing, right? It has a value-driven component and a material component. Yeah. And the material component in the reinforcement pedagogy, when you think about it, it's hardly to do with students at all.
Yeah.
It seems more to do with the government or something like that. So it's almost like
absolutely
two pedagogies, only one of which is really now to do with students. Would you kind of agree with that? Was that coming out?
Absolutely, Richard. That is, I mean, Brett. Sorry, Brett. That is absolutely what I agree with you completely. When you are focusing on covering content, you are focusing on achieving the government's goal to get these kids out of this grade into the next. Our pass rate, I don't know what your pass rate is. Our pass rate is 33%. You can pass with 33%. I mean, I don't want a doctor who has 33% operating on me ever. Okay, just in case the 77% is the one that needs him. So yes, I found that exactly. And you're right about the object. The object is a very slippery, and the object can shift. And what I find happens is, particularly in institutions like schools, is the more progressive object of developing students' understanding gets shoved away, and you're left with this let's get the government what they want. Let's test these children, test them. They haven't eaten in a week, but let's test them. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, absolutely. Phil has got his hand up.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Joanne. Super. Thoroughly enjoyed that. I wondered if I could ask a question that it's probably bordering on methodological, I think, but I was wondering how much you involved teachers in understanding the kind of theory of cultural historical activity theory, or whether you kind of left them at face value and you did the deeper stuff. Is that okay?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. That's an excellent question. And because of COVID, lockdown, and inability to go and face-to-face meet the teachers, and also our constraints, rural, urban, lack of electricity, and of course, we weren't allowed to travel. Our lockdown was very severe. You weren't allowed to exercise. You weren't allowed to take your dog for a walk. You weren't allowed to leave your front door. Boom. Bottom line. So in an ideal world, we should have worked with these teachers and spoken more about chats, but we didn't. So we used it as an analytical framework. So basically, I used it quite deductively to impose on the work. Is that the best solution? Probably not. What I want to do, and we've now got more data in, what I want to do, and now I can actually go and see these teachers. What I want to do is I want to work with the teachers and see if they identify in themselves some of the things that I have identified. And the way I want to do that is I actually want to videotape some of the teachers' lessons. So let's say we have Mrs. Norble, who's answered on the survey. I would like to actually go to her class and video her. Then I've got her static data from the survey, but then I've got the data from, and I can see, is my interpretation of the data what happens in the class, and how does she agree with that?
Yeah, it'd be fascinating to see in retrospect how they reacted. So that's great. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I saw you clapping.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. That's why I was excited. Thanks, John.
I don't see any more questions, so I'll ask another one if that's okay.
Yeah.
Not using my privilege. So one of the things about activity theory is it has a very strong focus on historicism, or historicity is the actual word. So the emergence of forms of activity out of earlier forms. So contradictions get posed, and then new forms of activity develop. And there was quite a lot of rhetoric around at the time of COVID, as though we were starting from a blank slate. It was like the asteroid has metaphorically hit, and now everybody just has to do exactly what they're told, and it will be a technological solution. So I wonder if you have anything in the data on that. The one bit I already saw was about the prior technological expertise, but I wonder if you asked them about what their pedagogical values were beforehand, or did you ask them some of the same questions for the almost, I don't want to go pre and post, but you know what I mean? Do you have any idea whether what they were doing before influenced these ideal types?
Strangely enough, Brett, we do for some of them, not for all of them. And it's actually a fluke. So it's not that I had this brilliant brainwave and collected 2 sets of data. It's a fluke. Some of these teachers who answered this, I actually have data on from following them for a couple of years in other research projects that I've been doing with them. Also, sometimes using chat. I'm fascinated with science. Now, I'm not a scientist in the sense of teaching science, but I'm sort of fascinated with the fact that our children hate it when, I mean, I loved science because I blew up the science lab. I mean, have you ever taken phosphorus and put it in air? It's amazing. It's really, it's an exciting thing. So I'm quite interested in that. But yes, I have got data. And you know what's interesting, Brett, and I'm just thinking about that data is, I would say, more than 60% of it is teachers, when they use technology, are incredibly defensive in low fee and no fee paying schools. They have only been trained 1 or 2 hours in using this technology. And the children who they really stand in, they are like, the child is not, doesn't have a say, okay? So no philosophy for children here, not in our classes. Okay, no, children, they don't ask questions, they get told. And their pedagogy is very much a hurry, quick, go, don't touch that, stick here, and very directive. So that would be very interesting to see, because my suspicion is that a number of them answered the survey, the open questions, based on what they thought I wanted to hear, because it's a huge policy speak here that children are active in their learning, that more collaboration, group work. So many of them mentioned group work, and I was like, in COVID, how? On a WhatsApp? I have to think about it. So I would be interested to see that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I also distrust some of this stuff when people give me over optimistic answers.
Yeah.
The next question, I think, comes from Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Joanne. That was really fascinating. I guess I want to come at it from the other end. Brett's just sort of noted the historicity, the kind of the reflecting backwards, and the context from which these things sort of emerge. And my question is the other direction in terms of the future. And what, if any, things from what you've learned and what you've sort of been researching about, your reflections on where that might take things going forward, both in these very different educational contexts, and what might be next for them.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I mean, it's difficult in my context, okay, because we are dealing with severe inequality, but we mustn't forget just about everyone has a cell phone. I mean, just about everyone. So we can harness technology. And I'm not a great lover of technology. I mean, you saw I had to call Warren in to help me just slow my slides down. I mean, I'm hardly a technological boffin, but I recognize through working with children that if we as adults are going to say that iPads and cell phones and stuff aren't useful as learning devices, we are going to miss the boat. Different heads are coming to us, okay? My daughter has a different head to what I had as a child. She is very quick attention span. I mean, very quick to notice things. She can sort of phase out and in ways I never could as a child. And we can ignore that and we can say, well, we're going to carry on teaching the way we've always taught. Or we can say, what can we do with this technology that we cannot do face to face? Okay, so not just technology for technology's sake. What can we do with this technology that can open pathways for students who are different to us. Technology does change the way you think. A pen, something like a pen. You know, when ballpoint pens came out in the 1900s, the whole world was in an uproar because now the children's brains would be impacted because they didn't have slate anymore, and they couldn't rub out on the slate, and the mark was there forever. And oh my God, okay, this changed everything. I can't remember the way an oral learner remembers. I can't, because I write everything down. I even write things on my hands. You know, if I have to remember, like I've got a lecture now, I write it on my hand. Okay, I external my thinking so that I've got a lot more thinking for other stuff. What do you think the computer's doing? What do you think iPads are doing? I mean, what do you think the access to information everywhere is doing? Is it important? Hypothetically, I'm not a teacher. Is it important that children know what 10 times 10 is when they've got it on their phone? Is it important, and this is something, my daughter's got a history exam tomorrow, is it important that you know that Mansa Musa took so much gold to Cairo in 1300 that gold was devalued? I'm not sure that's very important, okay? I'm not entirely sure. So I think we need to rethink the curriculum. We need to think how we can use these tools to move us forward. I don't think we can ever get rid of teachers. We can't ever get rid of humans, although we're doing a really good job of trying to get rid of ourselves. But we need to move on how we can harness technology to develop students. And that's actually what I'm doing. And one of the things I think we're missing, Jonathan, is gamification, and how these kids play games, how they're motivated by them, and how they're motivated to gather things from the games. Wouldn't it be interesting if we learned that way? Wouldn't it be interesting if there were games that taught us concepts we need to know? For example, to desalinate the sea, to make electricity. I mean, we live in Africa. Can you see it's actually it's a gray day outside, but look, see that sun? That's sun. We could have sunlight to power things, you know. So I think there is a way forward.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Thanks so much, John.
Thanks, Joanne. Yeah, it's interesting that my own question and Jonathan's question were like opposite ends of the same thing. There's even talk about, you know, that was the pivot to COVID teaching, and now we've just pivoted back as though we haven't learned any lessons, or that this just didn't happen, and we carry on now as though we just picked off from before. I think it's very regrettable that we're not trying to take these developments forward as though this thing, you know, really did happen and we learn from it. Anne-Marie, you have the next question.
Thank you much indeed, and thank you very much, Joanne. That's been fascinating on a number of levels. I suppose in a sense my question sort of connects with Brett and with Jonathan. I was interested to know whether you've had the opportunity to share some of your findings with the teachers, and if so, in what way they've been able to perhaps draw on some of those ideas and begin to think about some of the things that you were just touching on in the latter part of your answer to Jonathan's question. So you may feel you've sort of already answered, but if not,
no, it is a slightly different question.
Yeah,
it is a slightly different question, Anne. And yes, with some of the teachers, look, this is a survey, and it's rural schools as well, and I haven't had a chance to get out there, but some of the teachers who are here, we've workshopped and asked them what they think of our interpretation, specifically asked them what they think of not the model itself, but the construction of the model, what the model says. And they're very defensive towards the reinforcement pedagogy, as you'd expect. That's not me. I didn't write that. I'm the collaborative one. And that's because our government, all our government policy documents say, you know, you've got to be learner-centered. Although I don't know what the hell learner-centered versus teacher-centered can mean, because, you know, surely when you teach, you must be focused on a learner, and when you learn, you must be focused on a teacher. So that's a kind of isn't it this? Anyway, but our government is very much focused on this learner-centered thing. So we have done it, but I would like to go into the rural areas and to some of these no-fee schools. I was at a no-fee school yesterday in relation to this, actually, and I think before you came on, I was talking to Brett and Jonathan and Dee, and I was called to that school with three policemen, armed policemen, to help the children because one of them had been caught for armed robbery. And I was going to give them a talk on, I was actually going to give them a bit of a pep talk, because I thought, shame, if you're armed, if you're robbing someone because you're that hungry, it's pretty bad. And I was very interested in that school in saying to them, should we sit down and talk about these findings? And I just thought at that moment, with the three policemen there, and I tried to explain to the policemen that they were teenagers and that they weren't cognitively properly developed, that their dorsolateral, prefrontal dorsolateral cortex hadn't been properly developed yet, so they couldn't inhibit themselves. And he was saying, "Are we going to teach them how? We're going to teach them how." Yeah, so there's challenges.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. I don't see any more hands, so maybe I will abuse my privilege again. So one of the things about activity systems is, one of the things about activity theory is we want to study the real activity systems, not the kind of idealized ones. It's one reason why people like Erjo Engerstrom are so dismissive of concepts like learning environments that just kind of focus on the VLE or something like that. That's not the full activity system. And it strikes me that during the COVID pandemic, a lot of these students they have to learn from home, right? So the activity system is probably bringing in more things from home, the involvement of the parents, technological tools from home, opportunities, to collaborate at home with other family members and things like that. Do you get any sense that, teachers were kind of recognizing that and trying to make use of those resources, or were they viewing this as just a kind of narrower version of classroom teaching? Did you get any? I can see from your analysis it wasn't a dominant theme.
But Brett, it wasn't a dominant theme, but it did come through. In fact, I will send you the paper. It's in draft, okay, but I will send you the paper because it's got quotes from the teachers, from the actual data, and I did not expect to find that the relationships in impoverished areas between teachers and parents is often not very good, okay? Teachers blame parents blame teachers. It can be a problem. But they said things like, it's the first time I've ever spoken to this parent. I didn't know this one even had a parent. And now they've got the cell phone and I speak to them, and he's a pastor and he actually helped me with my church. And so there was definitely, that's a really interesting node to look at, is how the use of this technology opened up the community of the activity system. Because when you're in a school classroom, really it is just you and the teacher. It's you and the maths teacher. But when you're at home, it could be you and your older uncle, you and your mom, your gran, it's a lot more people, and there is data on that.
Thank you. So someone has asked a question in the chat. So the question is from Cure, who asks, could you please elaborate more on the significance of difference between objects and the instruments mediating the students' learning, especially from the no-fee schools? So he's asking for the difference between object and instruments in this.
Okay, so that's a good question. The object, there's two ways of looking at the object. For Leontiev, the object is the motive of the activity. Okay, so what motivates that activity? So in schooling, you would like to think that the motive is children's understanding or children's learning. Okay, so that's the one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at the object is how Kaptielinen looks at the object, where he talks about it as the problem space that is worked on. These two things are actually not vastly different, okay, because you are motivated to act on something. So if the object is something you act on and it's a motivation, you're motivated to act on it. Now, what is the difference between an instrument and an object? The instrument is the tool that you use to act with, okay? So you use your cell phone to work on children's understanding. You use your hammer to nail a nail into the wall, okay? That's your object, that's your tool, okay? Is a thing you use to change the object that you are working on, to interact with that object and make it into an outcome. So if you have a thing of clay and you put it on a potter's wheel, the potter's wheel and your hands are the mediating artifacts, and you're going around, and the object is the clay pot in its becoming, and the outcome will be the finished clay pot. Does that make sense?
Yes, Jonah, thank you so much. Because my assumption was object was also connected with the curriculum and content.
Yes, well, it depends. You see,
that?
it depends what your object actually is. It's not something that's out there in the world. It's something that you are pulled to work on. Oh, I feel like I must change this. Okay, that's when you know what your object is. So you don't always know what your object is until you are motivated to work on it.
Because I'm also thinking of object of the using of instrument for these students, when they use these tools, they have got some knowledge extracted from their use of the instrument, and it's, as you said, it's related to enforced pedagogy. So I'm also wondering if there's contradiction between their background and their knowledge, and the knowledge and tools in the school, and how Absolutely. You're onto two things there. The one thing you are onto is that there are contradictions between the instruments or the mediating artifacts and the object. But what you're onto, in even a more profound way, I'm not sure you know that yet, but what you're onto is what Brett was talking about as a new system. So out of this object, let's say the object becomes learning mathematics, and the children use the cell phone and they learn mathematics. They really understand calculus, okay? And then they use calculus in another activity system as their tool to build a building, which is the object. So you see how an object, it's quite tricky, but an object can become a tool in another system. And that's why it's fluid. And, I used to think, wow, this guy's making it too difficult, man. Why is Aereo doing this to my brain, Why can't we just have something that goes in a straight line, like, American psychology, where you just pop a pill? I'm happy with that. Think about it. Humans are really, really complex. Think how complex you are. You are here, sitting here with your glasses, looking at me, but you're not just who you are. You're a son. You might be a father. You might be a partner. There's the activity systems all around you, making you who you are. It's very complex. So when you think about humans as complex as that, then you can kind of forgive Aereo Engstrom and say, okay, maybe we are that messy. Thank you so much, Jonah. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. The reality is, some of these questions, you actually tend to find questions like that nearly every time I see an activity theory talk. It's obviously these are the places where activity theory is really counterintuitive, that we separate these things, and we also assume that motivation is not something that is driven from within and things like that, right? These are idiosyncrasies that, if you're not familiar with activity theory, they seem very, very strange indeed. So I think we're coming up towards the time where you needed to leave anyway, and I don't see any more questions. So I don't know if did you have any closing comments, Joanne, or are we?
No, I would just like to thank you guys for inviting me. As you probably realized I do love to bang on a bit. So it's always nice to get an invitation, and you know, I love to learn from you as I bumble through. So thanks very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much. So I'd just like to remind you that this seminar has been recorded. So if you want to watch it again, or indeed you have a friend who you think should watch it but who couldn't be here, then let them know that this will appear on the Department of Educational Research YouTube channel soon. And I'd like to tell you that the next online seminar in this series of events will take place on Wednesday, the 15th of March, 2023, and will be presented by Matthew Clark from the School of Education at the University of Aberdeen. The title being Re-articulating Teacher Identities, Ethical Risks and Potential Lines of Flight. So thank you very much for coming, everyone.